The sound of his own heartbeat drowned out everything else. Robert's grip tightened on the cold metal of the gun, his knuckles turning white. He could feel the sweat soaking through his shirt, but the chill in the air didn't register. Not anymore. His eyes were glued to the door, every second dragging by like a slow, suffocating suffrage. Tonight was supposed to be like any other, but nothing would ever be the same. The familiar sound of tires crunching against gravel came from the driveway, his wife's car. He could feel his pulse race with each passing second, the weight of his discovery pressing down on him like a ton of bricks. He wasn't sure how he got here, how it had all gone so horribly wrong. But there he was, standing in the hallway, waiting for her to walk through that door. And when she did, her eyes wide with surprise, it felt like the whole world stopped. "What's going on, Robert?" Her voice was shaky, uncertain. "Why are you? What is this?" Her voice, so familiar, sounded foreign now. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this disconnected from her, from the woman he had once sworn to love. That was before the sickness, before the lies, before he knew the truth. "Sit down." Robert's voice was calm, almost too calm, but his hand never wavered from the gun. His heart was pounding in his chest, every beat making it harder to breathe. She didn't sit. Her eyes darted around, confusion turning into panic as she backed away. "Robert, put that down," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "What are you doing?" "You knew," he said, his words sharp like daggers. His voice shook with rage, but there was also something else. Hurt. Betrayal. He'd trusted her. And now this. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then it came. The truth. "I know," she whispered. "You've known for months?" His words came out like a punch to the gut. The gun wavered slightly as his anger built again. "You've been lying to me this whole time?" She didn't answer, only shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. I didn't want to hurt you, but that wasn't good enough. It would never be good enough." The shouting started, a blur of accusations, questions, and silence that wasn't silence at all. Her tears mixed with his fury, but Robert couldn't stop. Not now. He was drowning in the weight of it all. Neighbors began to hear. They'd always been close, but now they were alarmed. Shouts, screams, desperation. The sound of a siren cut through the chaos, and for a moment, Robert paused. The blaring sirens outside felt like a twisted reminder of everything that had gone wrong, everything he had lost. They were coming. He didn't know what would happen next, but neither did she. The seconds ticked by. He had a choice. Before all of this, Robert's life was simple. Quiet. He'd retired from the force 5 years ago. His days no longer filled with the adrenaline of chasing criminals or solving cases. He traded in his badge for peace, settling into a rhythm with his wife Marie in the small town in Texas they'd called home for decades. They'd raised their daughter, Emily, together, watched her grow into a beautiful young woman who was now married and living in London with her husband. The house felt emptier, quieter, but Robert had convinced himself that it was just a new chapter. He and Marie had always been good together, despite the occasional bumps along the way. But those bumps had started to feel like mountains. The first time he'd caught her cheating, it nearly broke him. She'd been so apologetic, so full of promises that it would never happen again. Robert, as stubborn and proud as ever, chose to forgive her. After all, they had so much history. Years of love, laughter, and struggles together. He didn't want to throw that all away. They tried to move on, tried to heal. But healing wasn't as simple as saying sorry. It never really went back to how it was. For a while, they lived in a fragile truce. The trust once shattered had been pieced together, but only barely. Yet, in his heart, Robert told himself they were fine. Marie was fine. He held on to that belief as tightly as he could, hoping that it was enough. That was before the sickness. Before everything he thought he knew about his wife and his life was turned upside down. Before the truth came out, and it was no longer a question of forgiveness. It was a matter of survival. It all started with a simple cold. At least, that's how Robert first brushed it off. A scratchy throat, fatigue that wouldn't go away, and a fever that seemed to linger longer than it should. He told himself it was just the flu, nothing serious. But as the days passed, his body seemed to weaken. His skin grew pale, his energy drained, and a growing unease settled in his gut. After pushing through it for far too long, Robert finally went to the hospital for a checkup. It wasn't like him to worry about his health. Years of working in law enforcement had taught him to tough things out, but this felt different. Something wasn't right. The doctor's words hit him like a freight train. "You're HIV positive." Robert's mind spun, disbelief clouding his thoughts. HIV? How could that be? He wasn't some careless bachelor. He'd been married to Marie for over 20 years. He'd never strayed. He didn't even have any other reason to suspect such a thing. He didn't know much about the disease, but he did know it was incredibly hard to contract unless someone else was carrying it. A cold chill ran through him as the pieces began to fall into place. Marie, she had been the only one. She was the only one who could have infected him. His heart sank into his stomach as the horrifying realization hit him. The long-forgotten suspicions that had lingered in the back of his mind now clawed to the surface. How many times had she promised him she would be faithful, yet here he was, staring at his own test results, knowing the truth he didn't want to face. That night, his mind was a blur of confusion and anger. Desperation crept in, urging him to find the answers he so badly needed. He went home, his legs heavy with dread, and stormed through the house, rifling through Marie's belongings. In the back of her closet, tucked away in an old shoebox, he found them. Antiretroviral drugs. The same drugs he had read about online. The ones prescribed to people who were living with HIV. His hands trembled as he pulled out her test results, dated from 8 months earlier. The truth was there, in black and white. She'd known, and she'd kept it from him. The betrayal felt like a physical blow, the weight of it crushing him. His wife, the woman he had loved and forgiven so many times, had not only lied to him, she had infected him. Robert sat on the edge of their bed, the small shoebox of evidence in his hands like a burning coal. His mind spun in 1,000 directions, each thought more twisted than the last. Anger surged in his veins, but it was quickly followed by a cold, hollow disbelief. How could this have happened? How could she do this to him? They had fought for their marriage, worked through the lies, and built something together, only to have it shattered in the most unforgivable way possible. He tried to steady his breath, but it came in short, frantic gasps. His eyes kept flicking back to the bottles of medication, the test results. The truth was there in plain sight, but he still couldn't wrap his mind around it. Marie, the woman he had loved with all his heart, had betrayed him in the worst way imaginable. She didn't just break his trust, she had put his very life at risk. The memories came flooding back, a series of flashes he couldn't escape. He remembered the first time he had caught her cheating, the anger, the betrayal, the heart-wrenching confrontation. He'd been ready to walk away, but she had begged him to stay. She promised she would never do it again, that she would be faithful. And he believed her. That moment felt like a lifetime ago. And yet, here he was, caught in another lie. A lie that carried a far heavier cost. His heart raced as he recalled all the little signs he had ignored over the past months. The late nights, the strange excuses, the distance that had slowly crept into their marriage. He had been so blind, so desperate to hold on to the illusion of happiness they had built. Why? Why would she do this to him? They'd been through so much together. His mind raced, but no answer seemed to make sense. Robert tried to piece together the puzzle, but each answer only led to more questions. Why hadn't she told him? Was it guilt, shame, or something deeper? Was this a betrayal of love, or was there something more sinister behind it? All he knew was that the woman he had trusted with his life, his very life, had shattered that trust beyond repair. The frustration boiled inside him, like a pressure cooker waiting to explode. The sound of tires crunching against the gravel jolted Robert from his spiraling thoughts. His heart rate spiked, matching the pounding in his chest. He hadn't planned for this moment, but it was here, unavoidable, like a storm that had already broken the horizon. Her car was pulling into the driveway, its headlights slicing through the darkness. His breath quickened. He felt as if the world was closing in around him, the weight of the gun heavy in his hand. He could hear his pulse in his ears, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. This was it. This was the moment he would finally confront her, the woman who had destroyed everything he thought he knew. With trembling hands, he rushed to the safe, yanking it open, pulling out his handgun, his grip tightening around the cool metal. The coldness of the weapon mirrored the chill in his gut. This wasn't just a confrontation. This was a reckoning. The car's engine cut off. He could hear her footsteps, slow and steady, as she made her way toward the front door. Robert's hands shook, but he steadied them against his sides. He stood there, waiting, as the door creaked open. Marie stepped inside, the soft click of the door behind her signaling her arrival. She froze when she saw him, standing in the middle of the room, the gun aimed directly at her. Her eyes widened in surprise and confusion. "Robert? What the hell is this?" Her voice quivered, but there was a sharp edge to it. She was trying to keep her composure, but Robert could see through the cracks. She knew something was wrong. "I need answers, Marie," Robert said, his voice icy, controlled, yet full of a quiet rage. He wasn't sure if it was the shock of what he had discovered or the betrayal, but his words cut through the air like daggers. "What is this? What the hell have you done to me?" Marie took a step back, her hands raised, trembling. "What are you talking about? What's going on?" "The tests, Marie," Robert snapped. "The drugs, your tests. Don't you dare try to lie to me again." His voice rose with each word, his grip on the gun tightening. The shock on her face turned into panic as she tried to back away, her eyes wide with fear. "Robert, please," she begged, her voice cracking. "It's not what you think. I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean?" Robert's anger flared. He couldn't listen to her anymore. His mind raced, everything he'd discovered boiling over in an instant. "You've known for months, haven't you?" "You've known, and you let me get infected." Her eyes welled with tears, and her voice broke into a scream. "Robert, I didn't want this. I never wanted to hurt you." She stepped toward him, her hands shaking as she reached for him, but he stepped back, the gun still pointed at her chest. Neighbors were beginning to hear the shouting now. The walls in their small suburban neighborhood were thin, and the argument was loud enough to draw attention. The windows shook as the raised voices echoed through the street. The panic was spreading as more and more of their neighbors realized something was terribly wrong. Across the street, one of them reached for the phone, dialing 911. "We need help! There's a disturbance! He's got a gun!" Robert's mind barely registered the sound of the sirens growing louder. He was caught in the heat of the moment, drowning in the anger and pain that consumed him. But in the back of his mind, he could hear the sirens growing closer, the police on their way. The clock was ticking. The walls were closing in. As the argument raged on, Robert's mind drifted, against his will, back to the early days of his life with Marie. He remembered the way her laugh used to fill their home, the warmth of her touch, the comfort of her presence beside him. They had been young, once. Their love had been simple, effortless. He'd sworn he would spend the rest of his life protecting her, loving her, building a future together. He remembered their daughter, Emily, walking down the aisle, beaming with happiness. The proud smile on Marie's face as they stood side by side, watching their little girl take the first step into her new life. It was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives, and for a moment, it was. Robert had looked at Marie then, feeling the weight of their years together, memories of good times, of laughter, and shared dreams. But those memories, once so vivid, now felt distant and fleeting, like an illusion he couldn't hold on to. The flashbacks came like waves crashing over him, dragging him back to the painful moment when everything started to unravel. He remembered the first betrayal, Marie's affair. It had been a slap in the face, the kind of blow he never saw coming. The pain had been unbearable, but he had forgiven her. She'd begged him to stay, promising it would never happen again. And like a fool, Robert believed her. He wanted to believe in her, wanted to believe that love was enough to erase the scars of betrayal. But now, as he stood facing her, his gun trembling in his hand, all of it seemed like a lie. Her promises, her apologies, the years they had spent together, the silence between them in these last months had been deafening. It was as if the person he had loved and trusted had disappeared, replaced by someone who had betrayed him in the most unforgivable way. He wasn't just angry at her actions anymore. It was the silence that hurt the most, the absence of honesty, the quiet acceptance that they were both pretending everything was okay when it wasn't. What had once been love was now twisted, broken, and shattered by a betrayal that went deeper than he could ever have imagined. The distant wail of police sirens grew louder, cutting through the chaos of the room. Robert's breath caught in his throat, his pulse hammering in his ears. The sound of sirens was like a hammer to his skull, signaling the inevitability of everything spiraling out of control. He wasn't sure when it happened, when the situation had gone from bad to worse, but now it was too late. The sirens were coming. They would be here any second. He had no way out, no way to undo the damage. His mind raced, thoughts colliding like a train wreck. The shame of his situation crushed him. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on his chest, suffocating him. He had been a man of honor once, a police officer. He had sworn to protect and serve, but now he stood in his own home, holding a gun to the woman he had loved, ready to destroy everything. The image of his career, his years of service, his pride flashed before him, but it was all meaningless now. His life was over. He was HIV positive. He'd be living with that diagnosis for the rest of his days, never fully able to escape the shadow it cast over him. What would his life be now? The isolation, the constant reminder that his own wife had infected him. The guilt, the humiliation. He had never been a weak man, but in that moment he felt utterly powerless. And then the police. If he didn't end this now, they would come for him, arrest him. They would throw him in prison for the rest of his life. The thought of facing the consequences, the judgment, the shame, he couldn't bear it. His mind broke under the pressure. His heart twisted in agony, and all the anger, all the betrayal, and the hopelessness boiled over in an instant. Without thinking, he raised the gun, his finger trembling on the trigger. The first shot rang out, the sound deafening in the small room. It hit Marie in the chest. She gasped, a sharp cry of pain escaping her lips. Her hands went to her chest, her eyes wide with shock, but Robert didn't stop. "Why?" she whispered, her voice full of disbelief, but he couldn't hear her. He was already spiraling too far down. The second shot fired almost immediately, hitting her in the stomach. Her body jerked, the force knocking her to the floor in a heap. She didn't scream this time. She didn't even try to move. Her eyes, wide with pain and shock, locked onto Robert, but there was no more fight in her. For a moment, everything was still. The silence was suffocating. Robert stood there, staring at the woman who had once been his everything, but who had destroyed him, and in his despair, he turned the gun on himself. His fingers squeezed the trigger, and the world seemed to collapse inward. The shot rang out. The sound of sirens was no longer distant. They were close now, growing louder, but it didn't matter. The silence in the room was deafening, and everything that had been built between Robert and Marie was now gone, destroyed by rage, betrayal, and hopelessness. The door was only moments away from bursting open, but it was too late. The police arrived within minutes, their sirens screeching to a halt outside the house. Officers rushed through the front door, weapons drawn, their eyes scanning the room, expecting danger. But the sight that greeted them was far worse than anything they could have imagined. Robert and Marie lay in a tragic heap on the floor, lifeless, surrounded by the aftermath of violence. The air was thick with the weight of their deaths, the silence hanging heavy like a suffocating fog. One officer knelt beside Robert, checking for any signs of life, but there was nothing. His body was cold, a grim reminder of the final act he had committed. Next, the officer turned to Marie, her face frozen in pain, the blood staining her clothes a stark contrast to the peaceful silence that now enveloped the room. There were no more screams, no more pleading, just stillness. As the scene unfolded, the officer's shock was palpable. They carefully examined the area, noting the position of the bodies, the gun lying nearby, and the signs of a heated confrontation. A few minutes later, the investigation began in earnest. They found the evidence, her medication, her test results, and the clear signs of a betrayal. It didn't take long to piece together the tragic circumstances. The truth was undeniable. Robert had discovered his HIV-positive status, learned of his wife's secret, and, in a moment of overwhelming despair and anger, had made a choice that would end both their lives. As the police worked, questions lingered in the air, unanswered. Could Robert have found another way to cope? Was there any way out of the crushing weight of his situation without resorting to violence? The tragedy of the situation wasn't just in their deaths. It was in the hopelessness that led Robert to make the choice he did. So, what do you think? Was Robert's decision understandable given the overwhelming pain and betrayal he faced? Or was it pure madness? Could he have found another way to cope with the devastation? Or was he trapped by his emotions with no way out?